This talk was originally given on Symposium night on October 24th, 2020. The absurd notion that men of genius are born out of universal suffrage cannot be too strongly repudiated. It's easy to recognize the flaws in a system, yet difficult to improve upon it by fixing those flaws once such a system is established, especially if it's viewed as the best system yet tried. Whether this difficulty be because of the complacency of those under such a system, or because of an effort by those which the system benefits, it's hard to say. I'll talk today about those systems of democracy with universal enfranchisement. Basically any system in which some portion of political power, usually via a vote, is granted to every man and woman living within a state, generally excluding very few, if any, of those members. Although democracy itself is older than Christ, historical precedent for such systems of universal enfranchisement is quite thin. The United States, for example, did not implement universal suffrage until 1965. The United Kingdom, one of the earliest, not until 1918. France, not until 1945. Canada, 1960. Australia, 1967. Switzerland, 1971, as well as Afghanistan, 1971. South Africa, 1994. Saudi Arabia, 2015. And Greece, the vaunted birthplace of democracy, not until 1953. I bring up this recency not to say that it invalidates the idea, of course, rather only to illustrate the relative nascency of this idea. Indeed, what democracy meant for most of its history was a system by which a small portion of the population, consisting of the most well-informed and educated, were granted political power. So what are the supposed benefits of universal enfranchisement? Surely the systems of government under which most of the Western world are living wouldn't incorporate elements which aren't conducive to the well-being of the citizens of a country. The first and by a long shot foremost of these reasons in favor of universal suffrage is the quite libertarian idea that each man has a right to self-governance, that no one knows what's best for someone better than themselves. And yet I don't find this idea convincing enough to condone universal suffrage. A man surely has the right to steer his life in any way he sees fit. But if we wish to live in a society with certain rules and protections, then concessions on liberty must be made concerning actions which affect the lives of others. Any of the rights which we typically talk about as being granted or protected by the government deal only with those rights which have no or only a little effect on the lives of others. The right to free speech, the right to have access to firearms, the right to marriage, the right to free travel. All of these rights are really just barring the government from actively doing something to you. They're all the rights which you would have in a state of nature, which the government has restrained themselves from taking away from you. In contrast to this, the right to enfranchisement on a universal basis is the government granting somebody else, based on the grand qualification of being alive, some element of political power over your life. Both of these things are referred to as rights, and yet the effects which they have on a man's life are entirely different. So because the right to vote is part of the second type of rights, and as such has a larger implication on the lives of others than a simple natural right, like the ability to own land or get married, there should be a higher standard in order to be granted this right. Now, we could simply bar everybody from such a right, and have each man live like the perfect libertarian, unable to affect the lives of others in any way, but this is a mere pipe dream. Decisions need to be made, so political power needs to be distributed in the best way possible. In order to hold political power over others, one should first show an ability to self-govern, as well as a competence in the areas which the vote concerns. Without these, how can one be supposed to make a well-informed decision? And surely I don't need to expand upon why a well-informed voter would make a better decision. In spite of all this, Western democracies have continually trended towards more and more universal enfranchisement for the past century, placing what should be a high bar inches above the ground and passable to any idiot. And in such a system, where the quality of the voter base is necessarily much lower than it could be in a more restrictive voter pool, is the dream of representation for every man even achieved? Who can really be said to have a vote in such a system? If, statistically speaking, a major media network knows that each election cycle it can reliably influence the votes of 10 million fool voters, then who has the power? Does the one ballot of the informed voter, or perhaps 3 or 4 if they can influence a few friends and family, amount to anything? Doesn't the system where the most elite handful hold most of the political power resemble an oligarchy more than a democracy? The boardrooms of Fox News and CNN house the true electorate in our country. I propose, instead of this idiocy, a system which would paradoxically restore the voice of the people by taking away the right to a political voice from most. The system I propose is simply a modified democracy, namely an epistocracy. An epistocracy, from the Greek episteme, basically meaning knowledge, is the rule of the knowledgeable. Since all major Western democratic systems are not pure democracies, epistocracy could be inserted alongside most, if not all, existing systems, without much upset to the functioning of those governments. The United States, for instance, would cease to be a democratic republic and would simply become an epistocratic republic, where suffrage is not granted to every citizen, but where the most qualified citizens only are allowed to vote. The systems by which knowledge can be tested are several, and some experimenting to get to the best results would probably be necessary. It likely will involve some test on basic civics or some such thing. The details, however, are not as important as the outcome. In the end, a very small subset should be selected from the citizenry, perhaps as small as 1%, and this pool of citizens would be allowed to vote as per the existing rules of that country. In order to ensure equal access to all, any and all materials required to study for these exams should be made available freely at public institutions, such as libraries and on government websites. The right to cast a vote should be attainable to all as equally as possible. So what would be the hurdles to implementing such a system? As I've said, most Western governments could easily replace the democratic portions of their systems with similar epistocratic ones without much fuss. So the hurdle wouldn't be one of practical implementation. And while it might be supposed that the common people would object, this after a time wouldn't be the case. Even under the more repressive regimes of the world, Iran, Afghanistan, China, and Russia, the vast majority of their citizens hold their governments in very high regard and never question their legitimacy. No, the hurdle would come from the existing power structures which benefit from the unequal power afforded to them by our existing system. Simply put, why would the entities which hold such power and such sway in our democratic system give up that power? And short of a violent opposition, it would need to be a voluntary surrender of power. As remember, they can influence a large enough portion of any uninformed voter base to enact their will. This hurdle to me seems insurmountable. In our current system, the political power of the relatively small number of informed citizens simply cannot match the string pullers and their armies of dregs. Given this reality, I can see only two scenarios. A continuation of the current power structure, with more and more power being daily divested from voters of quality, or some sort of revolution. Some sort of Charlemagne or Bonaparte to come in and destroy enough of the existing power structures to eventually leave room in the rubble to implement a system in which voter quality is again the criteria by which the electorate is chosen, as it had been for over 2,000 years of democracy.